Every night, after the lectures wrapped up and the rest of the students had headed home, one man stayed behind. Not to study, not to revise his notes. He'd walk down to the public wells at the edge of the agora, pick up 2 heavy water jugs, and spend the hours before dawn hauling water for the market gardeners on the edge of the city. Manual labour, heavy, repetitive, unglamorous. The kind of work most people try to avoid. So when people in Athens, and it was exactly the kind of city where people would ask these things, wanted to know who was funding his philosophical education or which wealthy household was backing him, he would just hold out his hands. The calluses told the whole story. He was paying for it himself, water by night, wisdom by day. His name was Cleanthes. He'd shown up in Athens as a young man with 4 drachmas in his pocket, basically nothing, and a determination to study under Zeno of Citium. He eventually left as the head of the Stoic school and as the author of one of the most beautiful philosophical poems to survive from the ancient world. He's not exactly a household name, but without Cleanthes there's a real chance the Stoic tradition would have quietly dissolved when Zeno died. He was the one who kept the flame going. Welcome back to the Stoic Mind Mechanic. I'm Tim Howell. Last time we followed Zeno of Citium from a shipwreck to the painted porch of the Athenian marketplace, where he founded one of history's most enduring philosophical schools. If you haven't caught that episode yet, I'd suggest starting there, but this episode stands on its own just fine. Today we're meeting the 2 men who built on what Zeno started. First, Cleanthes, who took over from Zeno and kept the whole thing alive through sheer force of character, and then Chrysippus, the philosopher who turned Stoicism from a living school of thought into a complete, rigorous intellectual system, the man who, according to ancient sources, gave Stoicism the architecture it needed to last 2,000 years. 2 very different men, 2 essential contributions, so let's start with the water carrier. Cleanthes was born around 330 BC in Assos on the northwest coast of what is now Turkey. Before philosophy, he was a boxer. Not a recreational boxer, but a professional prize fighter. The ancient sources describe him as physically powerful, the kind of build that only comes from serious athletic training. He arrived in Athens with almost nothing, 4 drachmas by one account, barely a week's lodgings. He presented himself to Zeno, was accepted as a student, and then immediately ran into the problem that serious students have always faced. How do you pay for an education when you have no money? Cleanthes solved it in the most straightforward way he could. He got a job. Night shifts at the wells hauling water for the market gardens. Some accounts also mention him working as a baker's assistant. Manual work in the dark hours so that the daylight hours could belong entirely to philosophy. There was real irony there. Athens was a city that associated serious intellectual life with leisure, with the kind of financial freedom that let a man spend his days in discussion rather than labour. Zeno himself had been mocked for this as an outsider, and here was his student working literally as a labourer to sit at the school. But what the ancient accounts emphasise is that Cleanthes was completely unembarrassed by all of it. He carried the water, he showed the calluses, and when people challenged whether a man who worked with his hands could really be a serious philosopher, his answer was perfect. My poverty demonstrates that I can live according to my own teaching. Just think on that for a second. He didn't say my poverty is a hardship I'm enduring. He didn't say this is a temporary thing that will improve. He said my poverty is evidence that the philosophy actually works, evidence that when you genuinely internalize the Stoic teaching, that external circumstances can't touch your fundamental well-being, you discover you don't actually need very much at all. Now, Cleanthes wasn't a brilliant innovator in the way that Zeno had been, or the way Chrysippus would be. The ancient sources are pretty candid about this. He was called slow. Other students teased him for needing to hear things repeated. Zeno apparently described him as being like a hard writing tablet, difficult to inscribe, but once something was written, it stayed permanently. But what Cleanthes had, in a way that mattered enormously for the tradition, was something rarer than brilliance. He had steadiness, he had loyalty, and he had genuine living faith in the ideas he was practicing. Of everything that Cleanthes wrote, almost nothing survives, but one piece comes down to us nearly intact, and it's remarkable, the Hymn to Zeus, the only substantially complete Stoic poem from the early school. A quick word before I quote from it. When the Stoics talked about Zeus, they weren't picturing the human-like deity of Greek mythology, the one that hurled thunderbolts at people who annoyed him. For the Stoics, Zeus was a name for something much more abstract and more profound, the Logos, the rational principle that organises and permeates the entire universe, what we might call today natural law, or the underlying order of reality, or in some traditions, God. Keep that in mind as you listen. Most glorious of immortals, O Zeus of many names, almighty and everlasting, sovereign of nature, directing all in accordance with law, it is right for mortals to call upon you, for from you we have our origin, we alone of all that live and move as mortal creatures on the earth. What strikes me every time I return to this poem is the combination of intellectual rigour and genuine spiritual feeling. Cleanthes isn't performing piety here, he's expressing something he actually felt, a sense of participation in a rational, ordered universe, and the responsibility that comes with being the only creatures on earth capable of consciously choosing to align ourselves with that order. He goes on to describe how everything in nature follows this rational principle, everything except humans, who alone have the capacity to resist it. And in that capacity for resistance lies both our dignity and the primary source of our suffering. In a way, that's the entire Stoic project compressed into a poem. We are rational beings in a rational universe. We can align with that rationality or we can fight it. The good life comes from alignment. Cleanthes led the school for 32 years after Zeno's death, a remarkable tenure. When he died, aged 80 to 99, depending on which source you believe, the school passed to the man who would become its greatest intellectual architect. If Zeno was the founder and Cleanthes the keeper of the flame, Chrysippus was the engineer, the man who took a living philosophical tradition and gave it the structural rigour to endure. Chrysippus was born around 280 BC in Soli in what is now southern Turkey, a city whose name actually gave us the word Stoicism, meaning a grammatical or logical blunder, which is quite ironic given that Chrysippus would go on to become one of the ancient world's most formidable logicians. He was, by every account, ferociously productive. The ancient catalogues list over 700 works attributed to him. 700. In a world without printing, without word processors, without research assistants, 700 works, written by hand, covering logic, physics, ethics, language, epistemology, and the theory of knowledge. Almost none of them survive. We have fragments, quotations embedded in other writers, or summaries from the likes of Diogenes, or excerpts preserved by later biographers. The loss is genuinely significant, but what we can reconstruct is enough to understand why the ancient world said of him, if there had been no Chrysippus, there would have been no Stoa. That's an extraordinary thing to say about the third head of a school. Not the founder, the third head. Zeno had planted a seed, Cleanthes had watered it, but Chrysippus built the greenhouse, developed the taxonomy, wrote the manual, trained the next generation of gardeners, and defended the whole operation against every competitor who tried to tear it down. He apparently wasn't enormously likeable. Ancient sources describe him as argumentative, fiercely competitive, and relentless in his criticism of rival schools. Someone who'd rather win an argument than make a friend. But here's what makes Chrysippus genuinely admirable rather than just impressive. He didn't only defend Stoicism, he stress-tested it. He found the weaknesses in Zeno's original formulations, the gaps and ambiguities, and worked systematically, relentlessly to resolve them. So what did he actually add? 3 contributions I want to highlight because these are the ones that most directly shape the Stoicism that reaches us today. The first is Stoic logic. Chrysippus didn't just use logic as a tool for philosophical argument, he developed it as a discipline in its own right. He created what we now call propositional logic, the formal study of how propositions combine and relate to each other. His work on conditionals and on patterns of valid inference was so sophisticated that it wasn't fully appreciated until 19th century logicians rediscovered it and realised that Chrysippus had anticipated them by 2,000 years. Just consider that. 2,000 years before Frege, before Russell and Moore were building the foundations of modern formal logic, a Stoic philosopher at a porch in Athens had already sketched the essential structure. Why does this matter for us as practitioners rather than professional logicians? Because Stoicism's insistence on clear thinking is not accidental, it's structural. The Stoic life requires good reasoning. Chrysippus built the tools. The second contribution is the theory of the passions, what the Stoics called the pathe. This is where Chrysippus has the most direct relevance to modern psychology, and it's something we'll spend real time on in later episodes. Chrysippus argued that the destructive emotional states, fear, excessive desire, distress, certain kinds of pleasure, are not simply feelings that wash over us. At their root, they're mistaken judgments, errors of reasoning. When I'm in the grip of fear, Chrysippus says, I'm not just feeling something, I'm believing something false, that the thing I fear is a genuine evil rather than a preferred indifferent. That insight, that emotions are at their core cognitive events, that they involve beliefs about the world and those beliefs can be examined and corrected, is the direct ancestor of cognitive behavioural therapy. The founder of CBT, Albert Ellis, read Chrysippus via Epictetus's writings and built a therapeutic model on exactly this foundation. We'll explore that connection in full when we reach the episode on CBT and Stoicism. For now, hold on to this thought. Chrysippus provided the theoretical architecture for the most widely used psychological therapy in the world. The third contribution is his articulation of fate and freedom. How can the Stoics believe both that the universe is deterministic, that everything unfolds according to the Logos, and that our choices are genuinely free and genuinely matter? This is one of the oldest and hardest problems in philosophy, and Chrysippus developed a sophisticated answer that philosophers still argue about today. His key move was to distinguish between things determined entirely from outside us and things determined through our own nature. How we respond to situations, he argued, flows from who we are, our rational personal character. And the ability to act according to our own nature is what real freedom actually is. Propositional logic, the cognitive theory of emotion, and the notion that determinism and fate are compatible with moral free will. Not a bad legacy for a man whose entire written output has been lost. I want to take a moment to reflect on what Cleanthes and Chrysippus, so different from each other, have to teach us beyond the philosophy itself. There's a particular kind of contribution that history tends to overlook. We remember founders, we celebrate original genius, the first articulation, the founding moment, Zeno and his shipwreck or Newton and his apple, and rightly so, because originality deserves recognition. But what about the people who consolidate, who take a fragile, newly born idea and give it the stability it needs to survive, who do the work of the second generation when the founding energy has faded and what's needed is the hard, unglamorous work of maintenance and development? Cleanthes held the school together for 32 years on the strength of his character, his consistency and his quiet, genuine embodiment of the philosophy. He didn't add much in terms of doctrine. He didn't need to. What he added was proof of concept, living, breathing, water-hauling proof that the ideas actually worked, that a person with nothing could live by them and flourish. Chrysippus systemized. He made Stoicism intellectually defensible against every attack. He built the logical architecture that allowed the philosophy to engage with the best minds of its age on their own terms and still hold its own. Together they represent two things that every serious intellectual and personal project actually needs. Somebody to embody it and somebody to build it. Character and system, practice and theory, the water carrier and the logician. You could make a reasonable argument that these two roles are what any institution, any movement, any project needs to survive its founders. Someone who lives the idea and somebody who builds the structure. Without both, it tends not to last. The Stoic school, thanks to Cleanthes and Chrysippus, had both, and it lasted for the better part of 5 centuries. I want to leave you with a line from Cleanthes' hymn to Zeus. He's praying, if that's the right word, for alignment. He says, "Lead me, O Zeus, and thou, O destiny, wherever your decrees have fixed my lot. I follow willingly, and if I did not, wicked and wretched, I should follow still." There's something in that which cuts right to the heart of the Stoic project. We don't have a choice about many of the things that happen to us. The storms come, the cargoes sink, and the diagnoses arrive. The relationships end, and the world does not ask our permission. But we do have a choice about whether we follow willingly or unwillingly. From the man who hauled water by night, who chose deliberate poverty, who was called slow and dim but outlasted and outshone nearly all his critics, Cleanthes is saying, I would rather follow willingly, I would rather align myself with what is than spend my energy fighting a reality I cannot change. This is not passivity. This is not resignation. This is a profound, disciplined, hard-won form of freedom. Your reflection for this episode: in your own life, where are you following unwillingly? Where are you spending energy fighting something that's genuinely not within your power to change? And what would it feel like to follow willingly instead? Next time we make the journey from Greece to Rome, we'll look at how Stoicism crossed the Mediterranean, how it adapted to a very different culture and a very different political context, and how a remarkable series of thinkers transformed a Greek philosophical school into the governing philosophy of the most powerful empire the Western world had ever seen. If this episode was useful to you, please like and subscribe. It really is the single most helpful thing you can do to support the channel. And if you know someone who's in the middle of their own kind of storm, someone who could use a reminder that something in them can't be sunk, share this with them. Keep calm, keep stoic, and I'll see you in the next one.